Marie Laveau's name is spoken in hushed tones, a name that stirs something both revered and feared. Her story is one drenched in mysticism, power, and darkness. But what if the version of Marie Laveau we think we know is only a fragment of the truth, a truth deliberately buried in the shadows of history? The tale of Marie, a woman born into slavery in 1801, has been deliberately obscured, with some of the most powerful truths about her life actively suppressed, erased from the pages of textbooks and even the oral traditions of New Orleans itself. Schools were told to skip her story, but why? The answer might be more unsettling than any of the legends surrounding her. In a city like New Orleans, known for its rich history and mixture of cultures, the truth about Marie Laveau holds the weight of a curse. Her power was undeniable. She was both a healer and a feared sorceress. Her influence reached the highest echelons of society, touching upon realms of politics, religion, and mysticism. But despite this undeniable influence, her story has become shrouded in mystery, a mystery that raises more questions than answers. What if this mystery wasn't just a matter of folklore and legend but a carefully constructed silence, one that purposefully hides the complexity and power of a woman who dared to defy the system? What if, in the fear of what she represented, the world decided it was safer not to let her legacy take root in the collective consciousness? The chilling truth is that Marie Laveau was much more than the rumors of voodoo priestesses and magical potions that float around her name. Born into slavery, Marie's life and eventual rise to prominence were rooted in the harsh, unforgiving world of 19th-century New Orleans. But it wasn't just the circumstances of her birth that defined her, it was her determination, her intelligence, and perhaps most of all, her ability to wield the power of belief. For in New Orleans, belief itself was a currency, one that could heal or destroy, one that could define a person's place in society. Marie had a way of knowing what people needed to believe, and she used that knowledge to amass a following. But not everyone was happy about her growing influence. The Catholic Church, the ruling class, and the societal elites were deeply disturbed by Marie's rise, not just because of her ties to the mystical world of voodoo, but because of the very power she embodied. It wasn't simply that Marie was a woman of color who had risen from the deepest depths of society to command the attention of the city's most powerful figures. It was that she held power in a way they couldn't control. Theirs was a world built on structures of control, power that came from wealth, race, and religion. Marie, on the other hand, wielded something far more potent, the power of belief and the fear it inspired. But there's something more troubling here, something that suggests the story of Marie Laveau has been silenced for reasons far darker than we might first imagine. There are stories that she held secret knowledge, knowledge that was dangerous, perhaps too dangerous to be shared with the world. As her influence spread, so did rumors of her powers. She didn't just heal the sick or perform rituals for the people of New Orleans. She was rumored to have the ability to change the fate of individuals, to manipulate the very course of events. It was said that she could summon spirits, speak with the dead, and even control the will of men. Some believed she held the secrets to eternal life, others feared she could bring death to those who crossed her. To many, Marie was no mere woman, she was something more, something darker, something that demanded respect and fear in equal measure. And yet, despite all of this, she remains largely absent from mainstream historical narratives. Why was the story of Marie Laveau deliberately erased? It is as if the very mention of her name is taboo, a silent pact to ensure that her power never truly enters the light of day. It's not just that she was feared in life, it's that her legacy was actively suppressed after her death. Her role in shaping New Orleans, both as a spiritual figure and as a political influencer, was minimized, even silenced. For decades, it was as though the truth of her life, the complex, multifaceted woman who operated both within the confines of the legal system and beyond its boundaries, could not be told. The answer may lie in the power she held over those who sought her services. Marie's influence went far beyond the realm of superstition. She was not just a practitioner of voodoo, she was a political force. In a city where race and class were often the deciding factors in one's fate, Marie bridged divides that society wanted to keep rigid. She provided help to the disenfranchised, to those who had no voice in a world that sought to silence them. She healed, advised, and offered solace to people of all walks of life, regardless of their social standing. And yet, because of this, she represented a direct challenge to the power structures that governed New Orleans. In a society built on racial hierarchy, a woman who had risen from the depths of slavery to become the most powerful figure in the city posed a threat, not just to the established order, but to the very idea of racial superiority that the elite sought to perpetuate. To maintain control, the powers that be needed to reduce her to myth, to distort her legacy into something monstrous. They needed to present Marie Laveau not as a person, but as a legend that could be written off as mere superstition, something easily dismissed by those who held the reins of power. By doing so, they could ensure that the real truth about her life, about how she defied the boundaries of race, gender, and class, would remain hidden, buried beneath layers of folklore and fear. But there is a darker implication here. The intentional erasure of Marie's story was not just about controlling her legacy, it was about controlling the narrative of power itself. What would it mean for the world to know that a woman, born into the lowest rung of society, could rise to such heights of influence? What would it mean for the oppressed and marginalized if they were allowed to see someone like Marie Laveau as a role model, a figure who not only survived but thrived, wielding power that transcended the boundaries imposed upon her? Her story is not just about magic or mysticism, it's about resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, about fighting against a system that was designed to crush you. It's about a woman who refused to accept the limitations placed upon her by society, a woman who found ways to manipulate the very structures that sought to enslave her. But in telling her story, we also have to ask the uncomfortable question: what happens when a figure like Marie Laveau rises to challenge the very foundation of the society that has controlled her? What lengths would the establishment go to in order to silence her? The truth of Marie Laveau's life has been buried for too long. And yet, in New Orleans, where the echoes of her power still reverberate through the streets, there are those who believe that she is not gone. Her presence lingers in the shadows, her legacy carried by the wind. And for those who are willing to look beyond the surface, the real story of Marie Laveau, the one that schools have been told to skip, is still waiting to be uncovered. In the early 1800s, New Orleans was a city steeped in contradictions, a place where cultures collided, where the old world and the new world coexisted in a delicate, often uncomfortable balance. It was a city shaped by the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and the complex web of French, Spanish, and African influences. The streets were filled with a vibrant mix of people, from wealthy Creoles to enslaved Africans, from merchants to musicians, from Catholics to practitioners of various forms of spiritualism. Amid this complex social fabric, New Orleans was also a city where dark secrets were often whispered rather than openly acknowledged, where myths and reality blurred in the shadows of its alleyways and courtyards. This was the world into which Marie Laveau was born, and it was here, in this city of contrasts, that her extraordinary story would unfold. Born around 1801, Marie was the daughter of a free woman of color, Marguerite, and a French father, Charles Laveau, a man of means who was linked to the elite class of New Orleans. However, it's important to note that despite her father's status, Marie's life began in the same harsh conditions as those of the enslaved people who populated the city. As a woman of mixed-race descent, Marie was still subject to the social constraints imposed on people of color, particularly those who were not born into the privilege of being free in a society that tightly controlled racial boundaries. She was, in essence, born into a world that was both full of promise and filled with severe limitations. It was a world where her heritage would have shaped her identity in profound ways, and in many ways, set the stage for the unique path she would walk in life. Growing up in New Orleans, Marie was exposed to a number of cultural influences that would become integral to her future identity. Her mother's African roots, combined with the French Catholicism that still permeated the region, gave Marie an understanding of both the spiritual world and the practical aspects of survival in a society where people of color were often treated as second-class citizens, if not outright property. But it wasn't just the spiritual traditions passed down through her maternal line that would shape her, it was also her exposure to the powerful, often dangerous social dynamics of the time. In a city where slavery was still a major economic force, where people of color were forced to navigate the brutal realities of the plantation economy, and where Creoles held power over nearly every aspect of life, Marie learned early on that she would need to master the ability to navigate this intricate web of power, race, and survival if she was to succeed. Her early life was marked by a series of challenges that would have broken many others. Yet, for Marie, these challenges seemed to only sharpen her resolve and define her place in the world. She was aware of the limitations placed upon her because of her race, but she was also acutely aware of the opportunities that lay in the unique position she held, one foot in the world of the oppressed and the other in the world of the privileged. Her connections to both the enslaved and the free Creole communities allowed her to move in both worlds, and it was in these spaces that she began to cultivate the power that would later define her. As a young woman, Marie began to make a name for herself, first as a hairdresser and then as a spiritual leader. Hairdressing, in New Orleans, was not merely a trade, it was a social role. For women like Marie, it provided access to the highest echelons of society, as her clients were often the wealthy and powerful women of the Creole and French communities. Through these connections, Marie developed relationships that would later help her rise to prominence as a spiritual leader. But her path wasn't linear. It wasn't simply a matter of using her beauty and charm to climb the social ladder, it was much more intricate. Marie was also deeply connected to the African spiritual traditions that had been passed down through generations of enslaved people in New Orleans. She learned about these spiritual practices through her maternal lineage, absorbing knowledge about the mystical and healing arts that would later make her one of the most sought-after practitioners of voodoo in the city. The syncretic nature of New Orleans' religious and spiritual practices provided fertile ground for Marie's talents to grow. While Catholicism dominated much of the city's public life, the enslaved and free people of African descent practiced their own forms of spiritualism, including voodoo. But voodoo in New Orleans was not a single, unified belief system. It was an amalgamation of African, French, Spanish, and indigenous Caribbean traditions, and its practices ranged from healing rituals to divination and spiritual ceremonies. For Marie, this spiritual blend was not just a set of beliefs, it was a tool, a means of navigating the complex and dangerous world around her. In a society where the enslaved were often seen as little more than property, and where free people of color were forced to live in the margins of society, voodoo offered both protection and power. It allowed Marie to engage with the world on her own terms, providing her with the means to influence events, cure illnesses, and offer solace to those in need. But it also provided a space where she could find her own power, a power that transcended the rigid racial boundaries of the society in which she lived. It is this aspect of her life that would become most dangerous to the established order. By the time Marie reached adulthood, she had already built a reputation for herself as a healer and spiritual leader. Her rise to power was not sudden or unexpected, but rather the result of years of building trust with the people of New Orleans. Word of her healing abilities spread throughout the city, particularly in the African and Creole communities, where her services were in high demand. She was called upon to treat ailments that doctors could not, to offer guidance to those in crisis, and to provide spiritual counsel to people from all walks of life. Her knowledge of herbs, oils, and spiritual rituals made her invaluable, and it wasn't long before she became a fixture in the city's spiritual landscape. But Marie's influence did not remain confined to the margins of New Orleans. As her reputation grew, so did her ability to shape the social and political landscape of the city. She became a close confidant to powerful figures, both white and black, who sought her counsel on matters ranging from personal issues to political intrigues. She was rumored to have influenced the lives of local politicians, business leaders, and even those in the Catholic Church. But it wasn't just her connections that made her powerful, it was the fact that she had learned how to navigate the racial and class divisions of New Orleans with ease, using her position as both an insider and an outsider to her advantage. Yet, as Marie's influence continued to grow, so did the tensions between her and the established powers of New Orleans. Those in power could no longer ignore her, and her power became a threat to the existing social order. This growing fear and suspicion would eventually lead to attempts to silence her, but as the legend of Marie Laveau began to take shape, it became clear that silencing her would not be so simple. Her legacy, much like the city in which she lived, would prove far more complex and difficult to suppress than anyone could have anticipated. Marie Laveau's influence began to take root in New Orleans long before her name became synonymous with the supernatural. Her talents as a healer, spiritual guide, and confidant to the city's elite were not immediately understood by those around her, nor were they fully appreciated. Yet, over time, her abilities began to shine in ways that transcended the usual practices of folk medicine and religious rituals. What started as whispers of her success in curing ailments and offering comfort to the poor soon escalated into something much more complex and terrifying. It was not just that she was a gifted healer, but that she seemed to possess a mysterious power, a force that was both feared and admired in equal measure. In a society where public health and well-being were often left to the whims of fate or the hands of a few, Marie Laveau became an anchor for many in New Orleans. The impoverished, the downtrodden, and the marginalized turned to her, finding solace not only in her remedies but in the sense of agency she offered. Whether it was through her knowledge of herbs, her spiritual practices, or her counsel, people began to view Marie as a kind of oracle, someone who could predict their futures and influence the outcomes of their lives. This perception only grew as she continued to work her way into the hearts and minds of the people of New Orleans. What began as simple acts of healing soon morphed into more extraordinary claims. People reported that Marie could cure not only physical ailments but also emotional and spiritual maladies that had long been considered beyond the reach of conventional medicine. Her remedies were said to restore balance to the mind and spirit, and for many, she represented a living bridge between the realms of the known and the unknown. As rumors of her power spread, the city of New Orleans, already a melting pot of cultures and beliefs, became an even more enigmatic place. A place where the line between the living and the dead, between the spiritual and the earthly, seemed to blur in the presence of this extraordinary woman. Yet, the very same power that made her a healer also made her a figure of suspicion and fear. Some began to whisper that Marie's influence was not just of this world, that she was in communion with forces beyond the understanding of ordinary people. The Catholic Church, in particular, grew increasingly hostile toward Marie's practices. The Church, which held considerable sway over New Orleans' population, found her connection to voodoo and the African spiritual practices that intertwined with it to be deeply unsettling. Marie's ability to heal through rituals that involved spirit invocation and the use of symbolic objects was seen as a direct challenge to the religious and social order of the time. The Catholic Church and local religious leaders condemned her practices, labeling them as dangerous, immoral, and heretical. But rather than diminish her power, the Church's condemnation only seemed to solidify Marie's standing in the community. For many, the very fact that the Church rejected her was proof of her authenticity. In a city where religious authority was often questioned, particularly by those who were not fully accepted by the dominant culture, Marie Laveau's defiance of traditional religious dogma positioned her as a champion of the oppressed. To the enslaved people, to the poor, and to those on the fringes of society, Marie was more than a healer, she was a symbol of resistance. Her influence began to extend beyond the realm of physical healing and into the political and social spheres. It wasn't long before Marie's name became one of the most talked about in New Orleans. Politicians, merchants, and socialites alike sought her counsel, knowing that her insight into their personal lives could give them an edge. Yet, despite her growing prominence, Marie Laveau remained something of an enigma. She was both a spiritual leader and a political influencer, straddling the divide between two very different worlds. She was a woman who had been born into slavery, but who had risen to become one of the most powerful figures in New Orleans. In a city where race and class were often the defining factors in a person's life, Marie defied the very system that sought to define her. But the deeper her influence grew, the more her enemies began to gather. Those who felt threatened by her power, particularly among the city's elite, began to take notice. Politicians who had once courted her for favors now turned against her, accusing her of being a dangerous sorceress who held sway over the minds and hearts of the city's population. Religious figures labeled her a witch, a practitioner of evil magic, and a threat to the very fabric of society. And, perhaps most concerning to the powers that be, Marie had become a symbol of defiance, a woman who had broken through the barriers of race and class to carve out a space for herself in the heart of New Orleans. As the whispers around her grew louder, so did the fear. For many, the power of Marie Laveau seemed to be more than just a matter of spiritual influence. There were reports of people who had come to her seeking her help, only to find their lives changed in unexpected and often unnerving ways. Some said they were cursed by her when they crossed her, while others claimed that their fates had been inexplicably altered after seeking her guidance. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, only added to the growing mythology surrounding Marie. She became a figure who existed not just in the real world but in the realm of legend. Her name was spoken with reverence, but also with fear, for she was a woman who seemed to wield the power to shape the very fabric of reality itself. The question on everyone's mind, of course, was how she had acquired such power. It was whispered that Marie's knowledge of the spiritual world was not limited to the realms of voodoo and folk magic. Some claimed that she had access to forbidden knowledge, knowledge passed down from ancient African traditions, from her own ancestry, or even from a source far darker and more mysterious. It was this very sense of the unknown that both captivated and terrified the people of New Orleans. For in Marie Laveau, they saw a figure who was both of this world and beyond it, a woman who held the keys to secrets that no one could fully understand. Despite the rumors and suspicions, Marie continued to flourish. Her home became a sanctuary for those seeking her help, and the powerful men and women of New Orleans continued to seek her guidance. But the more she became entrenched in the lives of New Orleans' elite, the more the city itself became a stage for her mysterious rituals. People began to notice that things were happening in the city that could not be easily explained. Strange occurrences, disappearances, mysterious deaths, and unexplained shifts in fortune, began to unfold with a frequency that suggested something more than coincidence. Was Marie truly a healer, or was there something darker at play? Were the things she could cure and the things she could not simply a matter of skill, or did they reflect a deeper, more sinister power? And so, as the legends of Marie Laveau's power continued to grow, so did the fear that she might one day cross a line that could not be uncrossed. But by the time this fear began to fully take root, Marie had already become something far greater than just a woman. She had become an institution, a force of nature. And as with all powerful forces, she would soon come to be both revered and feared in ways no one could have predicted. Her legacy, like the very city she inhabited, would be a tale filled with mystery, darkness, and the kinds of questions that would never be fully answered. As the years went on, Marie Laveau's presence in New Orleans only became more undeniable, a force that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the city. Her name was now synonymous with both power and mystery, and the whispers about her grew louder. No longer was she just a figure in the background, she had become a prominent force in the social and spiritual life of New Orleans. It was at this point that the first truly strange occurrences began to take shape, events so peculiar and unsettling that they could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Her influence seemed to stretch far beyond what anyone could have anticipated, reaching into corners of the city and the lives of its people that had previously been untouched. But it wasn't just the common folk who began to notice the strange aura surrounding Marie, it was the powerful elites of New Orleans, the very people who had once sought her counsel, who now started to view her with suspicion and fear. The first whispers came from the corridors of power. Politicians, wealthy landowners, and business magnates, who had once turned to Marie for advice on matters of fortune and influence, now began to pull back. What had once seemed like a blessing, her ability to foresee outcomes, heal the sick, and offer guidance, now seemed more like a curse. Those who had been in her favor began to fear that their reliance on her might have led them to be entangled in something they could not control. As more and more people came forward to describe their encounters with Marie, the accounts grew more and more bizarre. It wasn't just that people came to her seeking spiritual help, it was the outcome of their interactions with her that caused concern. Some spoke of having been cursed by her when they angered her, while others claimed that they had lost all fortune after crossing her in some way. Some even went so far as to say that their deaths had been foreseen, or worse, orchestrated. It was not just the ordinary folk who were speaking out, even the wealthiest and most influential figures in New Orleans had begun to fear what Marie might be capable of. One particular story began to circulate, a tale about a prominent businessman who had sought her out for assistance in a series of business dealings. According to the story, after receiving her counsel, his business flourished for a time, but he soon found himself in deep trouble. He lost his wealth almost overnight, and some said that it was Marie's doing. While the man never publicly accused her, the rumor that she had cursed him spread quickly through New Orleans. By then, the fear that had once been confined to the poorer districts began to seep into the upper echelons of society. Marie's role as a spiritual leader and healer was also increasingly questioned by the church. Catholicism had deep roots in New Orleans, and the local clergy had been wary of her from the start. Her association with voodoo, a faith that had its origins in Africa and was practiced widely by enslaved people, was seen as dangerous, a challenge to the orthodoxy of Catholic doctrine. The clergy had denounced her practices, warning their congregations about the satanic elements of voodoo, but it was clear that their words were falling on deaf ears. For the people of New Orleans, Marie's power was real, and it couldn't easily be dismissed. In fact, the more the church condemned her, the more her influence seemed to grow. For some, her defiance of religious authority only solidified her role as a powerful and mysterious figure. What made her power so unsettling was not just its scope but the fact that it seemed to have no clear explanation. Marie's followers were devoted to her, convinced of her abilities to influence the forces of life and death. But to those outside of her sphere, to those who didn't share her beliefs or understand her methods, it was unclear whether she was truly a healer, a sorceress, or something else entirely. The line between good and evil, between spirituality and superstition, seemed to blur around her, and it was this ambiguity that made her such a powerful, if divisive, figure in the city. By the time rumors of Marie's dark powers began to spread, there were already many who considered her a living legend. Stories circulated of her ability to perform strange rituals that could change the fate of individuals, heal the sick, or even raise the dead. But these tales also began to include darker elements. People spoke of her having the ability to curse her enemies, to summon spirits who could do her bidding, and to control the lives of the city's most powerful figures. Some even whispered that she had a direct line to the underworld, a place where she could call upon the spirits of the dead to do her bidding. The stories were wild, and the line between fact and myth began to blur. As the years passed, the tales of Marie's powers became more fantastical, as if the legend itself was feeding on the fear and reverence that surrounded her. It is clear, though, that there was more to Marie's influence than simple superstition. Her ability to navigate the world of the powerful while remaining deeply connected to the enslaved communities of New Orleans was unprecedented. Marie had managed to straddle the divide between two very different worlds, the world of the elites, with their wealth, privilege, and access to power, and the world of the marginalized, whose only hope lay in faith and community. In a way, Marie represented a bridge between these worlds, one that made the established order uneasy. Her knowledge of both the spiritual and political realms gave her a unique vantage point, and it was this position that allowed her to exert influence in ways that could not be easily explained or controlled. Yet, it was not just her political influence that made her a target, it was the way in which her power seemed to operate on a level beyond comprehension. While some of her actions could be explained away as mere coincidence or skill, others were harder to rationalize. The power that she seemed to wield over people's fates, the way she could bend circumstances to her will, was something that caused deep discomfort among those who viewed the world in strictly material terms. For the elites who once sought her help, the idea that Marie might possess a power that they couldn't understand, let alone control, was terrifying. One of the most fascinating aspects of Marie Laveau's story is the way in which the people of New Orleans reconciled her seemingly contradictory nature. To some, she was a benevolent healer who used her gifts to help those in need. To others, she was a dangerous force, one who could manipulate the very fabric of life itself. What made her particularly difficult to understand was her ability to blend these two seemingly opposing aspects of her character. She was both a symbol of hope and a harbinger of doom, a woman who could heal and curse, guide and destroy. And it was this duality that made her such a compelling, and ultimately terrifying, figure. As Marie's power grew, so did the fear surrounding her. What had begun as whispers among the common folk now took on a life of its own. Soon, stories of her supposed abilities circulated throughout New Orleans, filling the air with a sense of dread. The city, which had always been a place of mystery and intrigue, became even more so in her presence. For some, Marie represented the unknown, the things that could not be explained by logic or science. She was both a savior and a villain, depending on who you asked. Her name was spoken in both reverence and fear, and the city itself seemed to shift in response to her presence. People began to wonder whether the strange happenings that plagued New Orleans, the unexplained deaths, the mysterious disappearances, the sudden shifts in fortune, were connected to her influence. Was Marie truly a healer, or was she something darker, something that the world was not ready to comprehend? As the years passed, the mysteries surrounding Marie only deepened. Those who had once been her allies began to distance themselves, and yet, her power remained unchallenged. The question lingered: what was the source of her strength? Was it the spirits she called upon, or was it something more tangible, something within her that no one could fully understand? The answers remained elusive, buried beneath layers of myth and fear, leaving only the legend of Marie Laveau, a legend that would continue to haunt New Orleans long after her time. As the rumors surrounding Marie Laveau continued to swell, so too did the sense of unease that permeated the very air of New Orleans. The city, which had once thrived on its complex social fabric and layered cultures, was now teetering on the edge of something far darker. The wealthy elite, who had once sought her counsel in private, began to distance themselves from her. The public denouncement of her by the church and political figures became more vocal, casting a shadow over Marie's previously unassailable position. The establishment, feeling the tremors of her influence shaking the foundation of their power, sought to discredit her, to diminish the grip she had on the people. Yet, in doing so, they inadvertently elevated her legend. The more they tried to suppress the truth about Marie, the more they pushed her further into the realm of the mysterious and the supernatural. For those who had always been in the margins of society, Marie Laveau remained a figure of reverence. To the enslaved people, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized, Marie represented the embodiment of defiance, a woman who had risen from the depths of oppression to become one of the most powerful figures in the city. She was no longer merely a healer or a spiritual leader, she was a symbol of resistance. A symbol of hope in a world where hope was scarce. In the face of harsh societal realities, where the boundaries between the privileged and the oppressed were rigidly enforced, Marie showed that it was possible to navigate those lines and emerge victorious, even if only for a fleeting moment. But with this power came an inescapable truth: the forces that had once embraced her were now slowly turning against her. The political elite, unable to comprehend or control the sway she held over the masses, began to label her a danger. They viewed her as a challenge to their authority, a woman whose influence reached beyond the bounds of their control. What was more troubling was the way she connected people from different walks of life, creating an unspoken bond between the oppressed and the powerful. She had the ear of the city's most influential individuals, and her advice, whether it was sought for personal, spiritual, or even business matters, seemed to work. Yet, this very ability to bridge such vast divides caused alarm among those who thrived on the rigidity of the social hierarchy. It was one thing for Marie to be a spiritual leader among the downtrodden, but when she began to advise the very men and women who ran the city, when she started to influence the outcome of business deals, political decisions, and personal fortunes, her position became untenable. The establishment's fear of Marie was also rooted in something darker: the threat of chaos. They feared that her ability to move between the realms of the spiritual and the mundane, her connections to both the disenfranchised and the powerful, could destabilize the social order that kept New Orleans running. The system of slavery, the rigid class divisions, and the reliance on the racial hierarchy could not be allowed to falter, and Marie, in their eyes, had the potential to bring it all crumbling down. In a society where power was synonymous with control, both over wealth and the lives of others, Marie represented the ultimate wild card. She had the ability to manipulate both human hearts and the fates of individuals. This dual power, over both the material and the spiritual, was something no one in New Orleans had ever seen before. But the more Marie's power grew, the more she became an enigma. No one truly understood how she worked her magic, how she could foresee the future, heal the sick, or seemingly change the course of events. Was it just a matter of shrewd manipulation, the kind that anyone in her position could do with enough charm and intelligence? Or was there something more to her abilities? Did she have access to knowledge or forces that others did not? This uncertainty, this inability to explain her power through conventional means, only heightened the fear around her. Marie's connection to the spiritual world became a focal point of the growing tension. Voodoo, the religious practice she had embraced and which had been passed down through generations of enslaved Africans, was viewed by the elites with disdain and suspicion. To them, voodoo was a primitive, dangerous religion, a dark force that threatened the moral and social fabric of New Orleans. To their minds, any connection to such a practice was anathema to the civilized order they sought to maintain. And yet, for many of the city's poorest residents, voodoo was not only a form of spiritual solace but a means of survival. It was a way to resist the forces of oppression, to gain some measure of control over a world that was designed to strip them of their dignity and humanity. As the establishment's fear of Marie Laveau's influence mounted, so did their attempts to diminish her power. The Catholic Church, in particular, sought to suppress her growing reputation. Priests and bishops alike preached against her, condemning her as a heretic, a witch, a servant of the devil. But their denunciations did little to sway the masses. In fact, many began to see Marie's defiance of the Church as proof of her authenticity. She became a symbol of rebellion, a woman who dared to challenge the very structures of power that kept New Orleans in chains. Despite the mounting opposition, Marie continued to thrive. She wasn't simply a practitioner of folk magic or a healer. She had become something far more complex. The people of New Orleans, particularly the marginalized communities, came to see her not only as a spiritual guide but as a leader. Her ability to heal, to predict the future, to bring hope to those who had none, made her a beacon of light in an otherwise dark world. And it wasn't just the poor and oppressed who sought her counsel. Wealthy men and women, desperate for her insight into their troubled lives, began to seek her out as well. Marie's reputation as a healer, as a woman with an uncanny ability to guide the fate of others, only solidified her position. She became an almost mythical figure, someone whose power and wisdom seemed to transcend the physical realm. But as Marie's power reached new heights, so too did the desire to control it. The political and religious forces that had once sought to co-opt her influence now found themselves in direct conflict with her. Her refusal to submit to the established order, her refusal to conform to the societal expectations placed upon her, made her an uncontrollable force. In a city built on the separation of power, between the rich and the poor, the free and the enslaved, the spiritual and the secular, Marie refused to remain in any one category. She existed in the liminal spaces, the shadows where the lines between good and evil, power and vulnerability, could not be clearly defined. The pressure on Marie only intensified as she became more entrenched in the fabric of New Orleans. Her followers, too, began to take on a more organized, and at times, fanatical nature. Some saw her as a prophetess, others as a martyr. Yet, all were bound together by a shared belief in her extraordinary abilities and the hope that she could somehow change their fates. The Church, with its power to excommunicate and condemn, could not silence her, nor could the political elite, with their wealth and influence. Marie Laveau had become too powerful, too ingrained in the city's identity to be dismissed. And it was in this tension, between the forces that sought to control her and the forces that sought to protect her, that the true essence of Marie Laveau's power lay. The city of New Orleans, once a place of mystery and intrigue, was now at a crossroads. The conflict between Marie Laveau and the powers that be had become symbolic of a larger struggle, one between the established order and the forces of change. And as the city grappled with the figure of Marie Laveau, a woman whose power seemed to defy both explanation and control, New Orleans found itself forever altered by the legacy of the woman who had dared to challenge its most entrenched systems. As the struggle between Marie Laveau and the entrenched powers of New Orleans deepened, the very fabric of the city seemed to shift. The tension between the spiritual world and the material world, between the oppressed and the ruling elite, had reached a boiling point. Marie, who had once moved effortlessly between these two realms, now found herself at the center of a growing conflict that threatened not only her position but the delicate balance of power in New Orleans. The rumors, whispers, and half-truths that had followed her for so long began to take on new forms, and with them came an increasing sense of fear. This was no longer simply a matter of whether or not Marie could heal the sick or offer guidance to the lost, it was about something far greater. It was about control. It was about power. And, most of all, it was about the question of who would ultimately hold the keys to the city's future. Marie's influence, which had once been seen as a force for good by her followers, now seemed to be undermining the established order in ways that could not be ignored. What had started as a series of small miracles, curing diseases, foretelling the future, providing comfort to the downtrodden, had grown into something more. It wasn't just that Marie was offering people hope, she was offering them something much more dangerous, agency. In a society that had long been structured around inequality, where the elites held dominion over the lives of the poor, Marie's ability to change the fortunes of individuals had become an act of defiance in itself. The poor, the enslaved, and those without power had been able to turn to Marie for something they had long been denied, a sense of control over their own fate. For them, Marie was not just a healer, she was a liberator, a figure who transcended the boundaries imposed upon them by their social class or race. Yet, as her influence grew, so did the fear among the elite. They began to view Marie not just as a spiritual leader but as a threat, a woman whose powers threatened to unravel the very social order that had kept them in control for so long. The city's elite had long thrived on the exploitation of the enslaved, the manipulation of power, and the division of society along lines of race and class. Marie's defiance of these boundaries was, in their eyes, a direct challenge to their authority. And as their fear deepened, so did their attempts to suppress her. At first, the political and religious figures of New Orleans sought to undermine Marie in subtle ways. They tried to discredit her as a mere charlatan, someone whose powers could be explained away by the gullibility of the masses. They painted her as a woman driven by greed, using the suffering of others as a means to enrich herself. But as these attempts failed, the tactics grew harsher. Some of her followers were persecuted, and the church began to intensify its campaign against her practices. The church, which had long been the dominant force in the spiritual life of New Orleans, viewed Marie's voodoo rituals as heretical, an affront to the very foundations of their faith. But what they failed to understand was that Marie's power didn't come from the rituals themselves, it came from the belief in those rituals, the trust that the people had placed in her. To challenge her was to challenge the very faith of those who followed her, and this made Marie's power all the more dangerous. It was not just the church that sought to control Marie, it was the political figures, too. As the years went on, it became clear that Marie's influence was not confined to the spiritual or healing realms. She had begun to shape the political landscape of New Orleans, offering counsel to those who needed her insight. The wealthy landowners, the businessmen, the politicians, they all sought her guidance. But as they came to depend on her more and more, they also began to realize that her powers were not something they could easily control. Marie had the ability to see through the veils of politics, to understand the hidden motivations of those in power. She could influence the outcomes of deals and elections, but she could also just as easily ruin a man's reputation or destroy his career. It was this duality, the ability to both heal and harm, that made Marie such a potent and unpredictable force in the city. As Marie's political influence grew, so did the number of those who sought to undermine her. The elites of New Orleans, who had once courted her for her spiritual insights, now began to see her as a destabilizing force. She was no longer just a healer or a spiritual leader, she had become a player in the city's power struggles. And as with all power struggles, there were those who would stop at nothing to maintain control. Marie had become a pawn in a much larger game, one that was being played by forces far beyond her control. But despite the growing opposition, Marie remained steadfast. Her power, it seemed, was rooted not just in her ability to heal or foretell the future, but in her deep connection to the people. She was a figure who represented something that transcended politics, religion, or class. She was a symbol of resilience, a woman who had risen from the lowest echelons of society to become a force that could not be easily dismissed. It was this very resilience that made her so dangerous to those who sought to control New Orleans. For the city's elites, Marie Laveau was a reminder that the system they had built, one based on power, wealth, and privilege, could be upended by a single woman who refused to be controlled. The growing tension between Marie and the powers that be reached a breaking point. The Church, now fully entrenched in its opposition to her, began to take more direct action. Priests and bishops began to speak openly against her, warning their congregations of the dangers of engaging with her. There were even rumors that the Church had considered excommunicating her, a move that would sever her connection to the religious community and cast her out as a heretic. But even as the Church mounted its campaign, the people of New Orleans continued to turn to Marie. They saw her not as a villain, but as a protector, a woman who had stood by them in their darkest hours and had shown them a path forward. The political elite, too, began to take more drastic measures. Some feared that Marie's growing influence would lead to a complete shift in the city's power dynamics. They believed that if she continued to build her following, she could eventually become a rival to the very institutions that had ruled New Orleans for so long. And so, in an attempt to curtail her power, they began to discredit her in the eyes of the public. They spread rumors that she was involved in dark magic, that she had made pacts with the devil, that her ability to heal and predict the future was nothing more than an illusion. But again, these efforts only seemed to strengthen Marie's position. The more the elite sought to suppress her, the more the people rallied behind her. The culmination of this battle for control came in a series of public confrontations. Marie, ever the enigma, continued to navigate the growing tension with grace and confidence. She refused to be silenced, refusing to bow to the forces that sought to erase her. She continued her work, offering counsel to those in need, healing the sick, and performing rituals that brought comfort to the suffering. But the conflict that surrounded her only deepened. The church and political elites had now turned their full attention to her, and their efforts to destroy her were becoming more organized, more coordinated. But despite the pressure mounting from all sides, Marie remained a constant force in the city. Her followers, too, stood by her, unwavering in their belief that she held the answers to life's most difficult questions. As the battle between Marie and the elites escalated, it became clear that this was no longer just a fight for power, it was a fight for the soul of New Orleans itself. And at the center of it all stood Marie Laveau, a woman whose power could not be easily defined or controlled, a woman whose very existence challenged everything that the city's leaders held dear. As the conflict between Marie Laveau and the authorities reached its peak, the air in New Orleans became thick with suspicion and fear. The city, already a place of mystery and intrigue, now felt as though it were on the brink of an unsettling transformation. The growing antagonism between the Voodoo Queen and the established powers, both political and religious, had started to consume not just her life but the lives of everyone in her orbit. Every ritual, every prayer, every act of spiritual guidance was now laden with consequence. Marie's very presence in New Orleans had become a symbol of resistance and change, but also a reminder of just how precarious the balance of power truly was. Despite the attempts by the church and political elites to silence her, Marie's position only seemed to grow stronger. Her followers, many of whom had been marginalized by society, found in her a figure of unwavering strength. In a world where the enslaved were considered property, and the poor had little to no voice, Marie offered them something that could not be taken away: agency. She had risen from the very depths of oppression to become a force whose influence transcended race, class, and religion. Her ability to weave together elements of African spirituality, Catholicism, and local Creole customs had made her an irreplaceable figure in the social and spiritual fabric of New Orleans. But her rise to power had also made her a target. The elites of New Orleans, who had once sought her guidance and protection, now began to view her with a mixture of fear and distrust. Marie had crossed the invisible line that separated the spiritual world from the material world, and in doing so, she had become a threat to the very order that allowed them to maintain their control. To the powerful, Marie's influence had gone beyond mere superstition, it had become a challenge to their authority. They could no longer afford to let her be. The church, which had always held a dominant position in New Orleans, was perhaps the most vocal in its condemnation of Marie. Its representatives decried her practices as unholy and demonic, a corruption of the true faith. The Catholic clergy, in particular, viewed Marie's brand of voodoo as a direct affront to their teachings. The rituals she conducted, often involving the invocation of spirits, the use of talismans, and the invocation of the divine, were seen as heretical. Yet, despite their best efforts to discredit her, the Church could not completely erase her from the hearts and minds of the people. In fact, their condemnations only seemed to reinforce her standing. The more the Church preached against her, the more the people saw Marie as a figure of defiance, someone who had dared to challenge the established order and, in doing so, had given voice to the voiceless. For Marie's followers, her ability to navigate between the spiritual and material worlds was part of what made her so compelling. To them, she was not just a healer or a medium, she was a living testament to the power of faith, will, and survival. Her rituals, which blended African traditions with Catholicism, were seen as a way to reclaim power in a world that had been designed to strip them of it. Through her, they could access the spiritual realm and draw upon the forces of nature, ancestors, and spirits to change their fates. Her powers, whether real or imagined, had become the last bastion of hope for many who had been deprived of all other means of control. But as Marie's fame spread, so did the rumors that surrounded her. Some whispered that Marie had sold her soul to the devil in exchange for her power. Others claimed that she had learned the dark arts through secret, forbidden knowledge passed down through generations of voodoo priests and priestesses. These whispers, whether rooted in fear or jealousy, only added to the mystique that surrounded her. For the powerful elites who thrived on order and structure, Marie's ability to operate outside the bounds of reason and authority was deeply unsettling. It was not just that she defied the established religious and social norms, it was that she had the power to reshape the very foundations of society itself. As the months passed, tensions between Marie and the political and religious authorities reached new heights. The elites, desperate to regain control, began to intensify their efforts to discredit her. There were rumors of secret meetings, of plans to oust her from the city, of strategies to weaken her influence. But Marie, ever the enigmatic figure, did not retreat. Instead, she seemed to grow more resolute, more determined to continue her work. Her presence in New Orleans became a symbol of rebellion, but also of resilience. She had fought for survival her entire life, first as a slave, then as a free woman in a society that was not kind to women, especially women of color. The battle that now raged around her was nothing new. It was simply the latest chapter in a life that had been defined by struggle. But despite Marie's resilience, there were those who were beginning to worry about the consequences of her power. The more she became entrenched in the politics and spiritual life of the city, the more unpredictable her influence seemed to be. There were reports of strange occurrences, things that could not easily be explained by reason or logic. Some claimed that they had seen Marie work miracles, while others spoke of her ability to manipulate events and people with an almost supernatural precision. No one could say for certain whether these reports were true, but they added to the growing mystique that surrounded her. In the minds of those who sought to control New Orleans, Marie had become a force that could not be tamed. The fear that began to seep into the hearts of the city's elite was palpable. They could no longer ignore the fact that Marie's power seemed to be limitless. Her ability to influence both the physical and spiritual realms made her an unpredictable and dangerous figure. And yet, for all the power she wielded, Marie remained an enigma. No one truly understood how she did what she did, and that, in itself, was a source of both fascination and dread. It was not just that she had the ability to heal or predict the future, it was that she could shape the course of events in ways that defied explanation. Some believed that she was in direct communion with the spirits, that she had the power to move between the worlds of the living and the dead. Others believed that she had access to secret knowledge that had been hidden from the world for centuries. As the tension between Marie and the elites escalated, the city itself seemed to shift. The once vibrant, multicultural New Orleans began to feel more divided. The elites, who had once enjoyed a comfortable sense of control, were now facing an uncertain future. They could no longer rely on their wealth and influence to dictate the course of events. Marie, with her connection to the spiritual world, had become a wild card, a force that defied all attempts to be controlled or understood. And the more they tried to suppress her, the more they realized that she could not be silenced. The battle for control of New Orleans, which had started as a conflict between a powerful woman and the city's elite, had now become something much larger. It was a struggle for the soul of the city itself, for the future of a place where the line between the living and the dead, the spiritual and the physical, had always been blurred. In Marie Laveau, the city saw not just a woman, but a force of nature, a reminder that the world was not as ordered and predictable as the powers that be would have liked to believe. For the elites, Marie's presence was a constant reminder that they were not as invincible as they thought, that their control over the world was, in the end, only an illusion. As the conflict intensified, it became clear that there would be no easy resolution. Marie had become too deeply ingrained in the fabric of New Orleans to be easily removed, and the more the elites sought to suppress her, the more they pushed her into the realm of legend. Whether she was a healer, a witch, a sorceress, or a prophetess, Marie Laveau had become a symbol of something far greater than herself. She was a reflection of the struggle between power and powerlessness, between control and chaos. And as the forces of the city gathered against her, it seemed inevitable that the battle for the soul of New Orleans would reach a tragic, inevitable conclusion. As the tension in New Orleans reached its breaking point, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The once vibrant streets, filled with the hum of life, had become increasingly quiet, as if the very air was heavy with anticipation. The battle between Marie Laveau and the forces that sought to control her, the political elite, the religious authorities, and the powerful business magnates, had turned into something more than a personal struggle. It had become a symbol of the larger, unspoken forces that shaped the city itself, forces that had always existed beneath the surface but had now risen to the forefront. For some, it was a fight for the soul of New Orleans; for others, it was a fight to preserve the power structures that had long defined the city's social and political landscape. And for Marie Laveau, it was a fight for survival. As the elites of New Orleans began to escalate their efforts to undermine Marie, they found themselves up against a woman who seemed to be almost untouchable. The more they sought to discredit her, the more they pushed her into the realm of myth. Marie had become a living legend, and legends, as history had shown time and again, were difficult to erase. Every attempt to silence her only seemed to add to her mystique, turning her into a symbol of defiance and resistance. Her followers, many of whom had already been marginalized by society, found in her a figure who could not be easily destroyed. They saw her as someone who had risen from the ashes of oppression, a woman who had carved out a place for herself in a world that had long tried to push her down. For the Church, this was unacceptable. The Catholic authorities, who had long held a monopoly on spiritual power in New Orleans, viewed Marie's growing influence as a direct challenge to their authority. Her practices, which blended African traditions, voodoo rituals, and Catholic iconography, were seen as an affront to the true faith. The Church's condemnation of Marie was fierce and unrelenting, but it had the opposite effect of what they had hoped. Instead of diminishing her power, the Church's actions seemed to fuel her growing legend. To the people of New Orleans, Marie had become a symbol of spiritual independence, a woman who refused to bow to the pressures of an institution that had long been seen as a pillar of control and domination. The more the Church denounced her, the more the people rallied behind her. Marie's influence began to spread even further. She was no longer just a healer or a spiritual leader, she had become a force to be reckoned with, a woman whose very existence challenged the power structures of New Orleans. But as her fame grew, so did the stakes. The elites of the city, who had once sought her counsel, now began to view her as a threat to their very way of life. They saw in her not just a woman with spiritual powers, but a woman who could change the fate of entire families, of entire fortunes. She was a woman who could shape events, influence outcomes, and, most dangerously of all, alter the balance of power. For the powerful men and women of New Orleans, this was a nightmare they could not afford to ignore. But it wasn't just the elites who feared Marie. As her influence continued to grow, it became clear that her power was not simply spiritual. Her ability to heal the sick, foretell the future, and influence the outcomes of people's lives had a very real, very material impact on the lives of those who sought her out. Many of the wealthy men and women who had once turned to her for guidance now began to feel that they were beholden to her. Their reliance on her had left them vulnerable, and they began to question whether they had made a mistake by seeking her counsel in the first place. Marie had not just helped them, she had shaped their futures, and in doing so, she had forced them into a position of dependence. Some of the city's elites, realizing that they could not control Marie, began to see her as a puppet master, pulling the strings of their lives in ways they could not fully understand. This created an overwhelming sense of paranoia, as those who had once been in her favor began to distance themselves from her, fearing that they had become entangled in something much larger than themselves. Marie's ability to weave together the spiritual and the political was a power unlike anything New Orleans had ever seen before. She was not simply a woman who could read the stars or invoke spirits, she was someone who could shape events in the physical world. Whether it was guiding business deals, influencing political outcomes, or even predicting the death of a prominent figure, Marie seemed to have an uncanny ability to control the very course of fate. This made her both a revered figure and a terrifying one. Those who sought her out for help knew that they were placing their trust, and their futures, in her hands. And while many found that her guidance was invaluable, others began to realize that she had a power over them that they could not escape. For those who had grown suspicious of Marie, the idea that she could manipulate the lives of the city's most powerful figures was both unsettling and dangerous. The idea of a woman, particularly a woman of African descent, wielding such power in a society that was built on racial and class divisions was a challenge that could not be ignored. The elites, who had long seen themselves as the architects of the city's future, now found themselves facing an unpredictable and uncontrollable force. They could no longer ignore Marie Laveau, nor could they dismiss her as a mere figure of superstition. She had become a political player in her own right, a figure whose influence could not be easily relegated to the realm of folklore. As the pressure mounted, the elites of New Orleans began to take more extreme measures. They sought to undermine Marie's reputation through a combination of propaganda, coercion, and, in some cases, outright violence. Some of her followers were targeted, accused of witchcraft or of conspiring against the city's elite. The church, desperate to protect its hold over the people, continued to preach against her, warning their congregations that Marie's practices were sinful and dangerous. But despite these efforts to discredit her, Marie remained a constant presence in New Orleans. The more they sought to remove her from the public eye, the more she seemed to rise above their efforts. She had become more than just a woman, she had become an icon, a figure who represented the very spirit of resistance against the forces of oppression and control. As the battle for control of New Orleans escalated, the city began to change. The once immovable social hierarchy that had separated the wealthy from the poor, the free from the enslaved, was starting to show signs of strain. Marie's influence, though subtle, was beginning to chip away at the foundations of that system. For the first time in its history, New Orleans was a place where the oppressed were finding a voice, where the marginalized were being given power. And at the heart of that change stood Marie Laveau, a woman whose spiritual abilities were both feared and revered, whose very presence seemed to defy the traditional rules of society. The struggle between Marie and the forces of authority would reach its zenith in the years to come, but by then, the damage had already been done. Marie's name had become synonymous with power and resistance, and New Orleans would never be the same. The church, the elites, and the political authorities may have succeeded in diminishing her influence in certain ways, but they could not erase her legacy. Marie Laveau had become a part of the city's very soul, a figure whose power transcended both the material and spiritual realms. The more they sought to suppress her, the more her legend grew, and as the years went by, her influence continued to be felt in every corner of New Orleans. As the decades passed and the political winds of New Orleans continued to shift, the echoes of Marie Laveau's influence reverberated through the streets, the homes, and the very heart of the city itself. Even after her death, which, though shrouded in mystery, marked a definitive moment in the city's history, the legacy she left behind seemed to grow rather than diminish. Her name, her practices, and her power were woven into the fabric of New Orleans like threads in a tapestry, influencing generations long after the woman herself had faded into the shadows of time. Yet, as with all figures who leave an indelible mark on history, the aftermath of Marie Laveau's life was fraught with contradictions, myths, and questions that would continue to haunt the city. The immediate aftermath of Marie's passing was marked by a sense of quiet reverence. While the city's elite may have felt relief at the death of a woman who had challenged their authority for so long, many of her followers, those who had come to depend on her spiritual guidance, mourned her loss deeply. Marie had been more than a figurehead for them, she had been a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a world where little else could be trusted. For years, they had sought her wisdom in times of crisis, her counsel when the future seemed uncertain, and her rituals when the physical world seemed insufficient. With her gone, many were left to grapple with the void she had left behind, and they clung to the idea that perhaps some part of her spirit still lingered in the streets, in the homes, in the very soil of New Orleans. Despite the mourning, however, something more sinister began to emerge. Marie Laveau had never been a woman whose power could be easily understood or defined. And now that she was gone, the mystery of her life and her abilities only deepened. Her followers, some of whom were practitioners of voodoo themselves, began to spread rumors and tales of the events surrounding her death. Some claimed that she had made a secret pact with the spirits, and that her death was not the end but the beginning of a new phase in her power. Others whispered that Marie's influence had transcended death entirely, that she had become one with the spiritual realm, and that her powers were now at their peak. These stories, whether true or not, added to the aura of mysticism that surrounded her, ensuring that her legacy would never be fully erased from the consciousness of New Orleans.